William's hands, weathered and calloused from years of labor, tightened around the wheels of his chair as he rolled slowly down the cracked pavement toward the looming gates of the prestigious Crestwood Academy. Beside him, his grandson Liam walked with the nervous energy of a boy who understood too much too soon. William saw his own reflection in the child's dark eyes, the same quiet resilience, the same fire buried beneath years of pain. He wished Liam could be just a boy, unburdened by the weight of history, but the world had never been kind to men like them. The security guard barely glanced at them before stepping in their path. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice clipped, his gaze dropping briefly to William's useless legs before settling back on his face. "We have an appointment," William said, his voice steady but firm. The guard's lip curled slightly, as if the idea of them having an appointment was absurd. "Name? William Carter. And this is my grandson, Liam." A pause. The guard's fingers hovered over his clipboard, tapping it absently as he scanned the list. William already knew what was coming. "I don't see you here." "Check again," William insisted. "The headmaster himself scheduled this." The guard exhaled sharply through his nose and flicked his gaze toward the grand stone building beyond the gates, then back to them. "Wait here." He disappeared inside, leaving them standing in the chill of the morning, surrounded by manicured hedges and the murmured laughter of students who would never know their struggle. Liam shifted uneasily. "Grandpa, maybe we should." "No," William cut in gently, resting a firm hand on the boy's arm. "You belong here as much as any of them." But the world didn't see it that way. They waited. And waited. And when the guard returned, he wasn't alone. A tall, thin woman in a tailored suit strode toward them, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone carefully polite, but William caught the tension beneath it. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Crestwood Academy has a very rigorous admissions process. Given your grandson's circumstances, I'm not sure he would be a good fit here." The word stung more than he let show. He had fought in wars. He had worked until his body broke. He had buried his son and daughter-in-law and taken in their child, raising him with love and patience, teaching him about the world and its cruelty, but also about its beauty. And yet, here he was, still being told, without being told, that they were not welcome. He forced a smile. "His circumstances? Well," she said, shifting slightly, "we have a certain standard here. Our students come from families who can provide the right environment for academic excellence." "You mean money?" William said flatly. "And connections." "Mr. Carter, no, I understand," William said. "It's not just about money, is it? It's about who you think belongs. And you've already decided he doesn't." Liam clutched his grandfather's sleeve, his small fingers digging into the worn fabric. He didn't speak, but William could feel the shame radiating from him, could see the way his shoulders curled inward as if trying to make himself smaller, invisible. And that was what enraged him the most. Not for himself, but for Liam. For the fact that a child, his brilliant, kind, loving grandson, was already learning that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried, there would always be doors slammed in his face simply because of who he was. "You have my number," William said after a long moment. "If you change your mind—" He turned the wheelchair around, the gears creaking slightly, and started rolling away. Liam hesitated, glancing between the woman and his grandfather before following. The walk back to their small apartment was silent. William could feel the weight in Liam's steps, the quiet storm brewing inside him. Finally, as they reached the front door, Liam turned. "Why does it have to be like this?" His voice was small, but there was an edge to it, an anger William understood all too well. He sighed, rubbing his tired eyes before looking up at the boy. "Because people fear what they don't understand, and they hold on to power however they can." Liam swallowed hard, his little fists clenched. "Then what's the point? If they're never going to let me in, why even try?" William reached out and took Liam's hands in his own, his grip steady. Because trying is the only thing that ever changes the world. Liam held his gaze, uncertainty flickering in his young face. William squeezed his hands gently. They don't get to decide who you are. You do. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the city. Then, finally, Liam nodded. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was enough. And so the battle began. William made calls. He wrote letters. He spoke to journalists. He met with lawyers who worked pro bono. He knew this fight wasn't just for Liam. It was for every child who had ever been told they weren't enough. The news spread. The story of the elderly man in a wheelchair fighting for his grandson's right to an education caught fire. Some supported him, others sneered, but none could ignore him. And as the weeks passed, as protests formed outside the school gates, as voices rose demanding justice, William saw something spark in Liam's eyes. A fire. A determination. The understanding that change did not come easily, but it was always worth the fight. And William, despite all his years, despite the pain in his bones and the weariness in his heart, had never felt more alive. The cold crept through the thin walls of their apartment as William sat by the window, staring at the blinking lights of the city. The air smelled of rain and old wood, the floor beneath his chair groaning softly whenever he shifted. Liam sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his books, the dim light casting long shadows over his face. His pencil scratched against paper, erratic and frustrated, a rhythm that spoke of his storming thoughts. William watched him for a moment, the boy's lips pressed into a thin line, his brows furrowed in deep concentration. He had seen that expression before, on the face of his son when he was Liam's age, the same quiet fire, the same desperate need to prove himself. It was a painful kind of déjà vu. The school had not responded to William's letters, not officially. But the world had. Newspapers had picked up the story, painting him as a symbol of resilience, as an old soldier in a new war. Some called him an inspiration. Others called him a fool. He had expected resistance, had known the world would push back, but he had not been prepared for the depth of its cruelty. Hate mail had begun arriving at their doorstep, notes scrawled in angry ink telling him to stop fighting, to know his place, to accept the world as it was. Some were worse, words laced with venom, reminders that the past had not yet released its hold on the present. He burned those letters without showing Liam, without letting the boy see the way his hands trembled as he dropped them into the sink and set them aflame. But William could not hide everything. The phone calls came at odd hours, voices on the other end spitting slurs before the line went dead. Their landlord, once friendly, had grown distant, speaking in clipped tones when William rolled into the office to pay rent. The owners of the corner store hesitated now when Liam entered, their eyes tracking his movements as if expecting him to take something that wasn't his. Even the mailman, a man William had shared conversations with for years, had started delivering their letters with a certain stiffness, a reluctance in his step, as if touching their mail would somehow taint him. But William did not break. He would not. Because this was about more than him, more than Liam, more than a school. This was about the very foundation of what he had spent his life believing in, that a man's worth was not determined by the color of his skin or the weight of his wallet, but by the depth of his heart and the strength of his will. So he pushed forward. He found an attorney willing to take their case, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice like steel, who looked at William with something close to admiration. She told him they had a fight ahead of them, that Crestwood Academy had deep pockets and deeper connections, that even if they won the legal battle, the war would rage on in whispers and closed doors. William told her he had spent a lifetime fighting wars. He had no intention of stopping now. The lawsuit was filed. The news spread. Reporters began calling, some with genuine interest, others with the thinly veiled hunger of vultures circling over carrion. William chose his interviews carefully, speaking only to those who seemed to understand that this was not a story about pity, but about justice. Liam, despite his initial reluctance, began to stand taller in school. His teachers treated him differently now, some with encouragement, others with caution, as if unsure where to place him in their minds, troublemaker or trailblazer. The other students whispered, some in admiration, others in mockery. But Liam did not shrink. He met their stares. He let them know, in the silent language of the defiant, that he was not going anywhere. The nights grew longer. The fight grew harder. William woke to the sound of glass shattering one evening, his heart lurching in his chest as he pushed himself upright. Liam stood frozen in the doorway, his breath coming in short gasps. A rock lay on their kitchen floor, the window above it splintered into a spiderweb of cracks. William's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. He rolled forward, picking up the rock. A note was tied around it, the words scrawled in jagged, ugly letters. Leave or else. William turned it over in his hands. He heard Liam exhale sharply, a mix of fear and rage. The boy stepped forward, reaching for the note, but William pulled it away. "I'll handle this," he said quietly. Liam's hands clenched at his sides. "They think they can scare us." "They do," William said, looking up at him. "And that's why they do it. Fear is a weapon." Liam's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" William looked at the boy, his grandson, his legacy, his reason for every breath, and placed the rock on the table. "We don't let them win." The days blurred into weeks. The case trudged forward, slow and grueling, weighed down by bureaucracy and the unspoken biases that hung in the air like smoke. The school's lawyers fought back with everything they had, arguing that Crestwood was a private institution, that they had the right to decide who walked their halls. William's lawyer countered that education was not a privilege reserved for the chosen few, that opportunity should not be a locked door guarded by the wealthy and the powerful. The courtroom became a battleground, words clashing like swords, each argument cutting deeper into the heart of the issue. Outside, protests grew. People gathered at the gates of Crestwood, some holding signs in support of William and Liam, others shouting for them to go home. The tension in the air was electric, a storm waiting to break. And then, one evening, as William sat in his chair staring at the faded photograph of his late son, the phone rang. He answered it with a slow, steady hand. "Mr. Carter?" a voice said, clipped and professional. "This is Headmaster Whitmore from Crestwood Academy. I believe we need to talk." William sat in the dim light of their apartment, the phone pressed against his ear, his heartbeat a steady drum in his chest. The voice on the other end, cold and measured, belonged to a man who had spent his life in halls lined with old money and older traditions, a man who had never needed to fight for his place in the world. Headmaster Whitmore cleared his throat, a faint irritation in the sound, as if he resented even having to make this call. "Mr. Carter, I wanted to reach out personally to discuss your case before this becomes more complicated." William let the silence stretch between them, knowing that men like Whitmore hated silence, hated the feeling of uncertainty creeping into their well-ordered lives. "Go on," William said finally, his voice steady, his grip tightening on the armrest of his chair. "I understand that you are seeking admission for your grandson under the claim that our rejection was discriminatory," Whitmore continued, the words precise, stripped of any humanity. "I would like to assure you that Crestwood Academy prides itself on its rigorous academic standards. We simply do not believe your grandson would thrive in our environment." William exhaled slowly, staring out at the darkened city beyond his window. He thought of every door that had ever been shut in his face, every polite dismissal that was nothing more than a carefully constructed cage. He thought of Liam, hunched over his books, pushing himself beyond exhaustion because he had been taught that being twice as good was the bare minimum. "You mean he wouldn't fit in?" William said, his voice low measured, a quiet storm brewing beneath the words. "That's not what I said," Whitmore replied smoothly. "But since you brought it up, yes, I do believe your grandson would have difficulties adjusting. Our students come from families who can offer them a certain level of support, an upbringing that aligns with Crestwood's values." William let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter taste of something old and familiar. "You mean wealth, influence, The right connections. Widmore sighed, as if weary of this conversation, as if he were being forced to explain something so obvious it should not need explaining at all. We are simply upholding our traditions. William's fingers curled into a fist. Tradition is just another word for power held too long in the same hands. Silence. A long, uncomfortable pause, and then Widmore spoke again, his voice quieter now, more careful. I am calling to offer you a resolution. If you drop this case, I can ensure that your grandson receives a scholarship to a different institution, one more suited to his needs. A very fine school. He would receive an excellent education without the challenges that Crestwood would present. William closed his eyes. There it was. The offer. A chance to take the easy way out, to give Liam a future without the battle, without the sleepless nights, without the threats and the protests and the fear. It would be so simple to say yes. But then he thought of that rock shattering their window. He thought of the letters, the whispers, the moments Liam came home from school looking smaller than he had left, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched forward as if bracing for a blow that had not yet come. He thought of every child who would come after Liam, every boy and girl who would stand at the gates of Crestwood and be told, in words both polite and brutal, that they did not belong. And William Carter had never been a man who took the easy way out. He took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle deep into his bones, then spoke, his voice iron. No deal. Widmore's breath hitched slightly, just for a fraction of a second, but William heard it, that flicker of surprise, of disbelief that an old man in a wheelchair, a man with no money and no connections, would refuse him. Mr. Carter, I strongly advise you to reconsider. This case will not go in your favor. Then we'll see you in court. William hung up before Widmore could respond, the finality of it ringing through the silence. Liam stood in the doorway, watching him, his eyes wide, uncertain. What did he say? He asked, his voice small, but there was something else beneath it, hope, fear, the fragile beginnings of defiance. William turned to face him fully, the dim light casting sharp lines across his face. He wanted us to back down. Liam swallowed. And? William gave him a long, steady look, then nodded. We're not backing down. The trial date was set. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of meetings with lawyers, of gathering testimonies, of watching the world divide itself into those who stood with them, and those who wanted them to disappear. The protests outside Crestwood grew louder, voices rising in chants that echoed off the stone walls of the academy. Reporters hounded them, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into William's face every time he left the apartment. Liam learned to keep his head high, to look them in the eye and answer their questions with quiet determination. But the other side fought just as hard. Crestwood's legal team was ruthless, their arguments laced with condescension and veiled threats. They painted William as a bitter old man clinging to outdated grievances, Liam as a boy who would never succeed in their school even if they let him in. They brought in parents of Crestwood students who spoke of preserving the integrity of the academy, who smiled thinly as they explained that it wasn't about race, it wasn't about class, it was simply about maintaining the standards that had made Crestwood what it was. But William had lived long enough to recognize poison even when it was wrapped in silk. He sat in that courtroom, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap, and he listened. He listened as they dismissed him, as they dismissed his grandson. And then, when it was his turn, he rolled forward and spoke. He spoke of his life, of the battles he had fought, of the promises he had been given and the ones that had been broken. He spoke of his son, of his daughter-in-law, of the day he took Liam into his arms, and swore that he would never let the world take him down. He spoke of what it meant to be told you were not enough, over and over, until you started to believe it. And he spoke of Liam, of his brilliance, his kindness, his determination, of the fire that burned in him, a fire that would be snuffed out if the world kept telling him to stay in his place. The courtroom was silent when he finished. Even the judge, a man who had barely looked at them throughout the proceedings, seemed to be listening now. The verdict did not come quickly. It never did in cases like these. But when it finally arrived, when William and Liam sat side by side in that courtroom and heard the words Crestwood Academy is ordered to admit Liam Carter, William felt something break inside him. Not defeat, not exhaustion, but something older, something deeper. A chain that had bound him for too long. Liam turned to him, his eyes wide, his hands gripping the arms of William's chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Grandpa," he whispered. William reached up, placed a hand over Liam's, and smiled. They had won. But more than that, they had changed something. And change, William knew, was the most powerful thing in the world. The days after the verdict passed in a blur, but the world did not shift as easily as a gavel's fall. Crestwood Academy had lost, yet their acceptance was laced with reluctance, with a kind of forced civility that came from obligation rather than belief. The first day Liam stepped through the school's towering gates, William could feel the weight of every stare, the murmured voices of parents who had fought against this, who had whispered behind closed doors that this victory was a stain on their traditions. The headmaster did not greet them at the door. There was no grand welcome, no gesture of goodwill. Instead, a secretary led Liam through marble halls, while William watched from the other side of the glass, his fingers tightening around the worn edges of his wheelchair's arms. He had won, and yet the battle was far from over. Liam was inside, but he was alone. And that, William knew, was when the real fight would begin. The first few weeks were harder than he had anticipated. Liam came home with his shoulders weighed down, with exhaustion lining his young face, with stories of whispers in the hallways, of teachers who overlooked him when he raised his hand, of students who moved away from him in the cafeteria as if proximity itself was dangerous. They never called him names, not outright. It was more insidious than that. It was exclusion in its most cruel form, an unspoken message that he did not belong. His grades were flawless, his work undeniable, but that only made them resent him more. He could feel it, creeping under his skin, the doubt, the frustration, the quiet urge to retreat. "Maybe I should leave," Liam muttered one evening, his voice barely above a whisper, as he stared at his untouched dinner. William set down his fork, studying his grandson in the dim kitchen light, the way his hands curled into fists against the table, the way his jaw tightened, as he fought against something he did not want to say aloud. "No," William said finally, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "You fought to be here. You don't walk away now. What if it never gets better?" Liam asked, his voice cracking at the edges, a quiet plea buried beneath his anger. "What if they always look at me like I don't belong?" William leaned forward, his old bones aching, but his voice was strong, filled with something deeper than certainty, truth. "Then you make them see you," he said. "You don't ask for their approval. You don't wait for their acceptance. You show up every single day, and you remind them that you have every right to be here. You do not shrink, Liam. You rise." Liam swallowed hard, blinking rapidly, then gave the smallest nod. And so he did. He walked through those doors every morning, his back straight, his chin lifted, carrying the weight of every person who had come before him, every child who had come after. He did not let them break him. He excelled, not because he needed to prove them wrong, but because he had always been great, because he had always been worthy. And slowly, ever so slowly, the walls they had built around him began to crack. Not all of them. Some students never changed, their hatred too deeply ingrained, their fear too tightly woven into their existence. Some teachers continued to glance past him, as if he were invisible. But others started to see him. A girl who once ignored him began sitting near him in class. A teacher who had never called on him started nodding when he spoke. Small victories, barely noticeable at first, but William saw them. He counted each one. He watched as his grandson carved out a space for himself in a place that had never wanted him. He watched as Liam endured. But hatred does not die easily. One evening, long after the campus had emptied, Liam lingered in the library, poring over books, lost in the quiet hum of knowledge. William had told him to call when he was ready to be picked up, and so he waited, his wheelchair by the door, watching the rain slick the pavement outside. The streets were quiet, the night thick with the smell of damp earth. He checked the time again. Too late. Too long. Something was wrong. He called Liam's phone. No answer. William's hands trembled as he pushed himself outside, the wheels of his chair grinding against the cracked sidewalk. The school loomed in the distance, its windows dark except for the faint glow of security lights. He reached the gate, his pulse thudding in his ears, and then he heard it. Voices. Sharp, cruel laughter. The unmistakable sound of struggle. And Liam's voice, choked and breathless. William's breath left him in a sharp exhale, and then he was moving, pushing forward, faster than he had moved in years, his old body filled with something raw and ancient, something primal. He turned the corner and saw them. 3 boys. Crestwood uniforms. One holding Liam's bag. Another gripping his shirt, shoving him against the brick wall. Liam's lip was split, his eyes burning, his fists clenched, but he had not fallen. He had not broken. "Let him go!" William's voice cut through the night like a blade. The boys turned, startled. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, the ringleader, sneered. "Or what, old man?" William rolled forward, his hands steady on the wheels, his gaze locked onto the boy with the kind of certainty that only comes from a lifetime of battles. "You think you're strong?" William said, his voice low, measured, filled with something unshakable. "You think power comes from knocking down someone smaller than you?" The boy's sneer faltered just slightly. "You know what real strength is?" William continued, his voice unyielding. "It's standing even when the world tells you to kneel. It's facing men like you and not breaking." He turned his gaze to Liam. "Show them, boy." Liam straightened, his shoulders squared, blood on his lip, fire in his eyes. He did not move. He did not speak. He only stared at them, unflinching, unafraid. And then, one by one, they stepped back. Because there is something terrifying about a man who refuses to fall. They left. Cowards always do. William rolled to Liam's side, reaching up, wiping the blood from his grandson's face with the sleeve of his own jacket. "You okay?" he asked softly. Liam nodded. But there were tears in his eyes. Not of fear. Not of weakness. Of rage. Of defiance. And of something William recognized, something he had felt all his life. The need to change the world. They went home that night, silent but understood, bound by something deeper than words. The battle was not over. There would be more struggles. More doors to break down. More walls to shatter. But they would keep going. Because they did not shrink. They rose. The years passed, slow at first, then all at once, time moving like the tide, sometimes gentle, sometimes relentless, but always forward. Liam remained at Crestwood, and though the whispers never fully ceased, though there were still those who refused to see him, the world around him shifted in small, quiet ways. His name, once spoken with disdain, began to carry weight. His excellence could no longer be ignored. He shattered every expectation, not to prove them wrong, but to prove himself right. He won debates with words that left no room for doubt, broke records in academic competitions, stood on stages where others had never expected to see him. But the battle did not come without scars. There were nights he came home and collapsed into his chair, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with studying. There were mornings when he hesitated before walking through Crestwood's doors, as if bracing for a storm he could not see. William watched it all with quiet understanding, never pushing, never forcing, only reminding him that he was never alone. And Liam did not falter. Not truly. Not ever. Because he had learned from a man who had spent his life standing in the face of injustice. A man who had fought not with his fists, but with his will, his mind, his unshakable belief in what was right. The night of Liam's graduation, The sky stretched out in an endless expanse of deep indigo, stars flickering like old memories. The ceremony had been held in the grand auditorium, a room filled with golden chandeliers and polished floors, a place that had once seemed so distant, so unreachable. But Liam had walked across that stage, his name called, the applause hesitant but present, the weight of history pressing against his shoulders. William had been there, front row, his old hands gripping the wheels of his chair, his chest tightening as he watched his grandson take that final step into a future they had carved out together. Afterward, they sat on the balcony of their small apartment, the city stretching before them, the air thick with summer heat. Liam still wore his graduation robes, the fabric loose around his frame, his cap resting on the table beside him. He stared at the skyline, his face unreadable, his hands curled around the edges of the chair. William watched him, sensing the weight of something unsaid, the kind of silence that carried too many words. "You did it," William said finally, his voice rough with something unspoken, something too big to name. Liam exhaled a slow breath, shaking his head with a quiet, humorless laugh. "It doesn't feel like enough," he admitted. "I walked that stage, I got the diploma, but I keep thinking, what now? What next? There are still kids who won't get that chance. There are still schools that will do everything they can to keep people like me out." William nodded slowly, watching his grandson, seeing the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had burned in him all those years ago. "So what are you going to do about it?" Liam turned to him then, really looked at him, his jaw tight, his expression determined. "I want to change things," he said, the words quiet but filled with certainty. "Not just for me. For everyone." William smiled, pride swelling in his chest, something fierce and endless. He reached out, resting a hand on Liam's wrist, his grip strong despite the years that had worn him down. "Then you will," he said simply. And he meant it. Liam had learned the lessons William had spent a lifetime teaching. Lessons of resilience, of defiance, of love that stood taller than hatred. He had carried those lessons with him through every battle, and he would carry them into every fight that lay ahead. Because there would be more. There would always be more. The world did not change easily. But change was inevitable. And William knew, as he sat there beneath the quiet hum of the city, that Liam would be the one to bring it. Not for himself. Not for Crestwood. But for the children who would come after, the ones who would never have to wonder if they belonged. Because by the time Liam was done, the world would know. The world would see them. The world would rise with them. And that, William thought, was the greatest victory of all.